Well, as Steve was mentioning, I run a Bitcoin mining company, and we have been creating some content recently, but it's all been targeted at people who already know what we're talking about. And so typically goes very deep, very technical, and very niche, very fast. And Steve suggested that might be good to make something that anybody could understand, walk off the street and say, what is Bitcoin? And have a nice long form answer. So this is the attempt at doing that in an effective way. Um, I had to pull from other people who are smarter and thought about this before I did and for longer than I did. Uh, Most of the content of this is based off a talk by Jack Mallers in Bitcoin Atlantis that several of you probably already saw, that was titled Bitcoin is Time, I believe, something like that. And he drew from some written works by Gigi, a really early Bitcoiner who talked about Bitcoin as being time. And so this, if I were a good marketer, instead of saying a new way to look at Bitcoin, I probably would have titled this something like "Time is Money and Bitcoin is Time" or something like that. That would be really catchy. But all kinds of missed opportunities, like buying Bitcoin in 2013, will all be okay. So briefly, I'm going to try to cover the basics, Bitcoin 101, and a new fundamental way to look at how Bitcoin works. So the framework that we're using for this talk is Bitcoin is Time. And time is an acronym representing time, information, money, and energy. Those are the four big concepts that we're trying to clarify and show how Bitcoin either fits into them or reimagines them. So the first thing we're going to go into is, what is money? How did it come to be? What are the different sorts of money that have existed over the years? Energy, and why energy is important to the functioning and purpose of the Bitcoin network. Information, money as information. And then why time is so pivotal to Bitcoin. This is the big concept that I think gets glossed over, but that is supremely important and was really brought to light by some great talks recently. And we just want to highlight that because it's part of why Bitcoin is such an incredible innovation, is because of how it messes with and reimagines our sense of time. So at the very end, we're going to talk about fundamentals of Bitcoin that have to do with the kind of technicals, the way that the network actually runs, the design of it. But we're going to build that foundation with all of these different areas of study. So at the very end, we'll tie it all together. Hopefully, you understand by the end of this why Bitcoin is time and why that is both impressive, cool, and you should care. So the first question that people often ask is, what is Bitcoin? Or how would you describe Bitcoin to someone? To different people, it's going to mean very different things. We talked earlier, before getting into the talk, about currency versus store of value asset. Many people think of it as a medium of exchange or a form of payment. I personally see it more as a store of value. Money that is decentralized, something that doesn't depend on third parties for you to use, a censorship-resistant network, and a trustless network. These are all ways that you could describe Bitcoin and be directionally correct. So already went over this for a second, but we're using time to define what Bitcoin is. So it's these four components that are completely necessary for Bitcoin to exist the way that it is. It's the way that it interacts with time or creates time, the way that it transmits, distributes, and preserves information, the way that it acts as money, and the way that it reimagines money, and then how it interacts with our world of energy, physical energy that powers our world. So the most important part of this being that Satoshi truly invented a new way of accounting for and measuring time when he released the Bitcoin protocol into the world. And let's talk about how Bitcoin can be money. So starting off really, really foundational about what is money and how did it come to be. I would be willing to bet that everybody that you know walking around spends a lot more time interacting with money than they do thinking about it. Very few of us have ever taken the time to consider where it came from, why it exists, why we use it, why it takes the form that it does. And to go back, money originally came as a solution to the problem of trade. So we used to barter for nearly everything that we needed. If I were really good at making shoes, but I needed someone to make me a hat, I would likely trade shoes for a hat and give that person something that I could make in exchange for something that they could make. It was a system that worked, but it's very inefficient. Something called the coincidence of wants, where if I wanted to get a hat from one of you, I could make shoes, but all that you wanted was apples. I have nothing for you. There's nothing that I can do. There's a lot of friction now between either of us getting what we want. I have to go find someone with an apple, trade them my shoes, and then go get your hat, or vice versa, to go try and find what I want. And so forms of money were a technology that we invented as humans to try to solve this coincidence of wants in an efficient way and to transact with one another in a way that made sense, that was more high frequency, that allowed us to get more done. We naturally are very social and interactive creatures. We like to trade with each other. And so any tool that increases the effectiveness of that is valuable to us. So we started off with the barter system, trying to trade for whatever we want. And in the interim, came up with things called tokens. And tokens could take many forms, but they were essentially our first attempt at a solution to barter, a more efficient way to transact. And so very early forms of tokens were things like shells or glass beads. Metal coins that came along later were the most popular and widespread form of tokens that we would use to trade with each other. And so this was definitely an improvement over barter. It meant that you could use one standard unit of something to trade with someone, and they recognize its value, and you could hold on to it and use it later. It wasn't a consumable or something that would rot or become useless over time. Usually a token was something that was very durable and you could hold into the future. This was maybe one of the evolutions of how people could start to store wealth, is when they had tokens that had value over a long period of time. And so invention of tokens and the spreading of tokens allowed people to be more specialized. They could just make shoes, they could just make hats, and all of their needs would be taken care of as long as they were really good at doing what they were doing and could go create more tokens for themselves. So again, the difference between tokens and barter is that usually you're trying to get something useful to yourself out of barter, and it might not last very long. But this idea that you could have a unit that anybody else could verify is what you say it is and has value is something that changes our whole mindset around storing wealth or transacting value. So this is a review for some of you. There's 7 qualities of money that make a good money. And just going over them really quickly, money should be accepted as a medium of payment. It should be easily divisible into smaller units. It should be transportable, easy and convenient to carry and to trade across oceans. Money should be durable. It should be resistant to being easily destroyed or taken. It should be interchangeable, scarce, i.e. you can't easily go out and create more of it for yourself and devalue the rest of what exists. And it should serve as a reliable store of wealth, ideally. It should last far into the future and preserve whatever purchasing power it has to begin with. So comparing a couple of the forms of money that we talked about, we've got shells and beads on the far left side, gold, and then the US dollar. And we see the issues with shells and beads are it's not something that's easy to chop up. It doesn't make any sense to subdivide something like that. It's not going to be lasting far into the future. You know, shells and glass are things that degrade relatively easily over the span of years. And one shell or bead is not necessarily fungible for another. They haven't been stamped in a press. They haven't been cast in a foundry. And so it's not something that you can easily recognize and trade or barter with. Gold solves some of the problems of bad money, but it's still hard to divide into small pieces. It's still hard to transport large amounts of it. And even though it's the best money that we had as humans for a long time, on the order of thousands of years, it still is not perfectly scarce. It's something that we have nearly double the supply that we did in the 1940s in the world, because mining continues to add more to the supply. So, and then the dollar, we know that the dollar is not scarce. There's more than 40% of the supply printed the last 4 years, was my estimate. It's not a great store of wealth. If you take a dollar from 1913 and try to use it today, it's worth less than 1 or 3%, depending on how you account for that, of what it would have been all those years ago. And so all of these different qualities compared to each other, for a long time as people, we've been dealing with imperfect forms of money. So we've never really had a true benchmark for what we should be looking for in money, because something with all of the qualities of good money has never really existed. So we talked about barter, we talked about tokens, and the next invention, or the next evolution of money that was important, was the invention of ledger systems. And so as we started to trade more, as commerce started to expand across the globe, we needed more and more sophisticated record-keeping systems that could track transactions with high efficiency, high speed, and reliably across all kinds of peoples, to record their economic activities, their debts, their credits. Essentially, the first accounting and bookkeeping that got formalized and really distributed widely around the world was ledger systems that were trusted by all. And so they started as a way to track all of our transactions, eventually evolved to help us be more efficient in solving the ability to transact with larger global markets. Now, the issue with ledgers is that when we introduced a ledger that someone keeps that denominates what our debts and assets are, we're trusting someone, some central party, to decide what truth is. A ledger is just somewhere where truth is recorded, and whoever records it or keeps that record, you have to trust to be honest with it. The supply of US dollars in existence is a ledger. It's not something that is audited by all of us. It's one guy with a keystroke in the Federal Reserve that audits the ledger of what is in existence, what is actually in circulation supply. And so even though it was an evolution in efficiency, an evolution in easier exchange, it wasn't necessarily a perfect solution, because it means that we have to trust someone or some institution. So getting to Bitcoin, we needed to exchange money as soon as the internet came along in a very high frequency, very fast, very global way. And before Bitcoin, we essentially needed a trusted third party with a ledger. And so that could look like a PayPal, a Venmo, a Western Union, some other centralized counterparty that is enabling you to do your transactions, keeping them all in order and making sure that they're valid. When Satoshi invented the Bitcoin ledger, it was the first record-keeping system that could track transactions in an asynchronous way, in a decentralized way that doesn't depend on one single source of truth. And that's incredible, because nothing like that has ever existed before. There's never been a peer-to-peer money that didn't exist in the physical world that was a bearer asset. And so Bitcoin itself is a peer-to-peer network of computers that's distributed across the globe. Anybody that's running the Bitcoin software is essentially running a copy of that ledger. So rather than it living in one place and one person being able to change it, it lives in hundreds of thousands of places. And any one change doesn't affect the network unless everybody agrees with the change.
Are you saying that there's no single person or entity in the world that can control it?
That is my belief. In theory, if you have more energy than the entire network, which is more energy than some of the largest nations in the world at this point, you could co-opt it for a short period of time, as long as you kept expending energy to falsify it. But in terms of incentive, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do that. It would make more sense to just be a miner and be an honest validator of the network, because there's actually an economic incentive to expend the energy when you're doing it for that purpose. If you're doing it trying to break the network or invalidate it, all it takes is other miners finding another chain and going off and doing their own work, and you've just wasted gigawatt hours of energy. So it's not so much, and this is probably the important point, is that it's not so much that you could not destroy this as there's no real good incentive to do it.
Because if you do it, you destroy it. People will do it.
If you do it, you've made it not useful for as long as you can sustain expending the energy to continue doing that. It's a huge waste of resources. And it doesn't necessarily get the person any benefit. Because if you're trying to mine an invalid block or double spend a transaction, like you could not make a transaction valuable enough to warrant destroying the network, if that makes any sense.
And everyone would know that a single actor is now controlling it.
Right, and any other participants can just choose to not recognize that as a valid chain. In general, though, this is the first time where we've created a network that doesn't depend on a central authority, and is truly a peer-to-peer network. So any kind of trust in a centralized party is removed when you examine the way that Bitcoin is constructed. And so because it is peer-to-peer, because it is an open source network and it's just software that anybody can run, you don't need to ask anybody for permission to use it, and anybody in the world can use it and sign on from anywhere at any time. It's also completely transparent. So if you know how to read code, you can audit the blockchain. You can audit the software that it runs on. It's not some shadowy black box that you don't know how it works. It's open source code. Anybody can look at it and see how it runs and see every single transaction that happens. So it's truly the first open ledger that anybody can audit, verify, and sync up with. Might seem obvious since the topic of this talk is talking about Bitcoin as a superior form of money. But if you think about it, all of those important qualities of money, those are embodied by Bitcoin. So it is something that you can value as money. It's traded globally in a $1.34 trillion liquid market right now. It's the 9th or 10th largest asset in the world. So people definitely value it. It's divisible down to 100 million subdivided units. So you don't have to buy one Bitcoin. You can buy 0.0000001 Bitcoin if you want to. It's portable, literally the most portable thing that can exist. It's information. So you can carry all of your wealth in your head if you know how to remember a few words. It's durable because it's an information. It's information that lives on a distributed system. You would have to destroy every single computer running the software simultaneously in the world. You couldn't leave a single node running. Otherwise, it's unkillable. In my opinion, it's the first unkillable thing that we've seen come into being. So it's definitely durable. It's proven itself over several different serious events that it's a really resilient network. Doesn't really matter what you do to it, it will always come back. Fungible. Every Bitcoin is interchangeable with every other Bitcoin. You cannot fake a Bitcoin and use a fake Bitcoin on the Bitcoin network. It just doesn't work. Software won't allow it. Scarce. There's only going to be 21 million, as we discussed. Gold was great money for thousands of years. It's the best thing we had. A bearer asset that lasts far into the future, doesn't degrade. But there's still an additional 2% or so that's added to the supply every year. Gold mining is a real large business that makes more gold every year. And so even if you save in gold, you're getting devalued by 2% or so every year, not to mention the possibility of mining on asteroids or other, far into the future concepts of finding more gold or getting more efficient at creating it. And then as a store of wealth, there's no other asset that has outperformed Bitcoin since its inception in 2009. There's nothing else that has performed so well in dollar terms. I'm sure that will probably be the case far into the future as well, just because of all of the other qualities that we've outlined here. It is such a good type of money that it's likely that there's very little, if anything, that outperforms it over any span of time. So getting into the energy part, we talked about Bitcoin mining a little bit. I own a Bitcoin mining company, and so this is very central to what my part in the industry. But energy is the foundation of how our world runs. So it's the foundational commodity that informs everything else. It's what runs our machinery, transports all of our goods. In every single society around the world, increased energy use is directly correlated with advancement of that society, as well as the total wealth of that society. So it's not crazy to say that if you have a lot of energy, you have a lot of wealth. And so part of the critical innovation with Bitcoin is that it requires energy to make this. It's not something that is easy to create. You can't just print a new Bitcoin and it be valid. You have to actually expend energy in the form of proof of work. And proof of work is something that we're going to talk about for one slide today, but it's really something that we could talk about for hours and hours. That is the true innovation of Bitcoin, is integrating proof of work into the system, requiring energy to create something of value. In order for something to be good money, like gold, it takes energy to get it, right? When we go out and mine for gold, we're using heavy equipment, we're using specialized machinery, we're using man hours, we're using capital to go out and get this thing. And because it is hard to get, because it is hard to produce, it has value. And Bitcoin is the exact same way. If it were really easy for someone to print new Bitcoin, it wouldn't be considered new money. And so for that reason, Bitcoin was designed with proof of work, meaning that you have to expend a certain amount of energy in order for the reward in order for you to get a reward, as well as for the network to run. There's no way for the network to run without proof of work. And that is because you don't want it to be easy for someone to come in and change the network without expending some amount of effort, or you really don't want them to change it at all. But I would use, the US dollar is a great example. We had a huge amount of the currency inflated within the last 3 to 5 years. And it wasn't that it took anything other than someone essentially adding a few zeros to a SQL ledger for that to be the case. So, the currency supply expanded not by anybody going out and mining for dollars or, creating something of value. They genuinely just changed a subdivision or changed a zero. And so the fact that we have to expend energy to create this commodity is part of what makes it good money. And it would not be good money if it didn't take energy to produce. So without proof of work, we couldn't tie the network to the physical world and physical energy. And so proof of work is that enforced required cost that makes Bitcoin a truly hard money that isn't easily altered, changed, or erased. As I just mentioned, world governments can generate trillions with no work required. And there's other digital currencies that use different kinds of consensus methods that are not proof of work. And those are just different ways to validate their ledgers. The most common of which is proof of stake. I think POS is a very apt acronym for that, because that's truly what it is in terms of enforcing a fair set of rules. Similar to any bought out political system, proof of stake only gives control to the account holders with the largest accounts. So the people with the money make the rules, is essentially how a proof of stake system works. In a proof of work system, the people who expend energy validate the system, and it's actually very challenging to change the rules. And it creates an indisputable history of events that can't be altered. So when, part of the importance of this is that you're creating a ledger that updates consistently and you can't change the history of. So throughout time, it's an accurate record of everything that has happened and can't be falsified, even going into the past. And proof of work is the reason that can exist, is because every new transaction is taking energy to add. We're still on the energy side of this, but the difficulty adjustment is part of what plays into how the network itself creates time, is this way of constantly adjusting based on the energy that's being inputted into the network. but still keeping the same standard of time. So how, if people are going after this reward and there's always more miners coming onto the network trying to get this reward, why doesn't it just keep getting solved faster and faster? How does it stay at 10 minutes if there's always more resources being contributed to try and get that reward? And it's because of the difficulty adjustment, like you said. The network needs to keep its own consistent sense of time, and in order to maintain that regularity, it adjusts how hard it is to solve that algorithm to find that nonce in every block based on how quickly the miners are currently doing it. So it's this dynamically adjusting, hyper-competitive system that will scale back or forward its rewards depending on what kind of actual presence is on the network as far as mining power. So that gets us into the time component of this. And I found this illustration really helpful. So the scenario is husband and wife are both trying to make purchases at the same time. Husband is in Los Angeles and the wife is in New York. So they're in different parts of the world and they're trying to do a transaction at the same time. If in their account, they don't have a sufficient balance for both of these transactions, they have to depend on someone to tell which one came first, which one is the valid one, because both can't go through at the same time. So you have to figure out which one is the valid one, which one came first. How does this get solved? So in traditional banking, it comes down to the bank or the payment processor, whoever the central arbiter of truth is. And so you're trusting a central timekeeper to tell you which one was right, which one was the valid transaction. And in Bitcoin, there's no central piece of information or oracle or person that you can point to that says, this is the valid one. You have to have a system that figures it out itself. And so in order to achieve that, in order to get consensus and trust in a network that's decentralized, it's across the whole network of the world where there can't be any third party to make those decisions, you have to design a way for time to be accounted in such a way that it can be a network operated around the world and still obey the laws of physics. So without getting too deep, we'll get into this a little bit. You cannot physically propagate information across the world much faster than a few nanoseconds. Like it takes light time to travel around the world and propagate information. And so in order for that to actually happen, there has to be a way, a network that things can sync up outside of real time, but still account for their own time. And let's see if I can explain this a little clearer. There we go. So we take for granted keeping accurate time, but everywhere that we currently source our time, whether you're looking at your watch or your cell phone, has to be synced somewhere. So whether it's AT&T, Verizon, or some other central source of truth, we're all depending on an external timekeeper to determine what the truth of time is. And it seems like semantics until you have to design a monetary system that doesn't rely on anything else to stay alive. So Bitcoin literally had to invent its own sense of time in order for there to be validity and continuity of transactions across the world in a globally settled network. And so when we're not using the Bitcoin network, we trust that we're getting an accurate time, but there's really no way to verify because we're just trusting some supplier of that information. There's no global standard other than just what we agree on. So Bitcoin tracks time in a very different way. It doesn't require any kind of outside input on what time it is. It doesn't pull time. It creates its own time. And so this network essentially is, Satoshi, when he created the network, did not call it a blockchain. He actually called it a time chain or a distributed timestamp server. And so the problem that he was trying to solve is that time is flowing in one direction. There's a past that has already happened that is unchangeable. There is a present that is happening, and then an unknown future that exists in the physical world. And he had to model that in the digital space. Like we talked about with proof of stake, those rules can just be arbitrarily changed by users of the network. But Bitcoin needed to be designed in a way that time was a fixed concept and that it was generated from within the protocol. So how do we keep time pointed in one direction of the digital world to prevent the manipulation of time? And the answer is a distributed ledger that has lists of transactions and a timestamp that's validated by proof of work consensus. So you could not use any kind of outside time. And so you have to do these sequences of blocks that get added. When people solve a problem, the block is created, and then the block that's created needs to be regulated to only come out every so often. As we were talking about with the difficulty adjustment, if miners come onto the network and suddenly instead of 10 minutes for a block, it's 9 minutes or 8 minutes, the network has to say, okay, this is happening faster than 600 seconds, which is my prescribed amount of time that this should take for us to get to the next timestamp, the next timestamp. Instead, there's got to be a way for them to create a new block and then adjust how the network is accounting for time based on solely the inputs that are coming into the network, none of which are an outside accounting of time. So every 10 minutes, the protocol has a block added. And the reason that it's every 10 minutes is because, as we said, the speed of light takes time to travel around the world and for information to propagate among networks. And so in order to prevent non-valid transactions or double spends, there has to be ample time for every node around the world to come to an agreement on what is happening. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, these other networks that run on proof of stake systems, they come to consensus often in milliseconds, but they break all the time, and they rely on all these outside inputs in order to survive. And so we would not be able to get into consensus if the network didn't have this difficulty adjustment that constantly, throttled it forward or back, depending on what kind of miners are on the network. And as we've seen, I talk about this in terms of technological advancement in mining. Mining technology just gets more advanced. And so there's more and more computing power being thrown at this network all the time. So without this way of accounting for time and essentially keeping the block time constant through the difficulty adjustment, this network would just keep getting faster and faster and faster and faster. There would be, instead of waiting until 2140 for the last Bitcoin to be mined, it might take 5 or 10 years. And so there would be no consistency, there would be no standard of how this monetary protocol works far into the future if time kept on expanding and contracting arbitrarily. So keeping it at this 10-minute block time literally locks the supply in time into the future. So there's not any amount of energy that you or I could expend that means that we'll get more Bitcoin faster than the network releases it. It doesn't matter how much energy we put toward it. We may speed up the network for a period of, a few blocks or a few weeks, but every 2016 blocks or about every 2 weeks, the difficulty adjusts and it's going to slow us down. So there's this dynamically adjusting feedback loop that even though it's not exact, it's not always 10 minutes, we are getting on average about 10 minutes between every block so that there's a consistent way of denominating time within this network. Yeah, basically, the difficulty adjustment is to make sure that improving technology does not speed up the block time more than 10 minutes. It recalibrates about every 2 weeks, and essentially we've created the first decentralized clock that will run forever into the future, independent of any third party, any organization, or any government. So we talked about the halving for just a couple minutes before this, but the halving is something that occurs every 210,000 blocks for about every 4 years. It cuts the Bitcoin reward in half for the miners. This is a way of, one, bootstrapping the protocol in its early years to make the subsidy a large part of what miners earn. But it's also a means of enforcing a monetary policy that makes this asset valuable far into the future. If the supply of something is ever expanding, you have to have, forever increasing demand in order for it to remain valuable. It's not a great fundamental matchup. But if you have something that has an ever decreasing supply issuance to the point where it eventually levels out and there's no additional supply issued, that's something that in the face of increasing demand gets valuable and more valuable forever. That's a good store of value. And so despite the halving being, one of the more scary experiences for miners, it's really good for anybody that holds Bitcoin because it is a programmatic way of making sure that the value of this protocol is enforced and that it gets more valuable into the future, not less. The halving that's coming up in just 4 days or so is going to be the first time that Bitcoin's supply issuance is lower than the new supply issuance of gold that comes out every year. So it'll drop, I'm forgetting exactly, but I think gold is 1.5 to 2% or 2%, and we will drop the supply issuance to just over 1% of Bitcoin per year that will be newly added to the supply, making it the most valuable and the hardest to produce commodity in the world. So other consensus methods, we talked about proof of stake. So Ethereum is another very common network that people use. It takes about 15 seconds to process a transaction. Avalanche takes 5 seconds. Solana can be in the milliseconds range, and Bitcoin takes 10 minutes, as we described. Thank you so much. That is super bright. So I mentioned this briefly, but Solana gets this transaction speed in the milliseconds range because they are not truly getting consensus. It's someone's database somewhere that is transmitting this information. And so it's truly an innovation that Bitcoin can achieve global consensus on its own network. These other networks, their consensus is something that breaks all the time because it violates the laws of physics. It's not really achievable to propagate all this information all over the world at such a fast speed. It's part of why Bitcoin was designed with these longer block times, 10 minutes, so that you can actually get consensus among the users, not just rescue it with, a founder or an IT guy making sure that the network restarts and that you've got an old backup. A real global monetary network cannot go down, cannot be booted from a backup from some guy. It has to stand on its own, and it has to be able to last far into the future. And so Satoshi, the creator, knew how important decentralization would be to the success of the Bitcoin network. And that time of 10 minutes was set as the validation time very intentionally to ensure that there is legitimately enough time to achieve worldwide consensus. Getting close to the end here, we're going to talk about Bitcoin fundamentals a little bit. So the main numbers with the protocol, 21 million Bitcoin is the max that there will ever be. Every 2016 blocks, the difficulty gets adjusted. So that's that 2-week period, every couple weeks or every 2016 blocks. The difficulty changes and it gets either harder or easier to mine the next block right after that block. So there are halvings every 210,000 blocks. That's about every 4 years is what the clip has been. Blocks get validated about every 600 seconds or 10 minutes. And there will only ever be 32 halvings. So I love this equation because it simplifies, it's one mathematical expression that expresses how the Bitcoin network monetary policy works. So from the 0 halving to the 32nd halving, that's the last one that'll ever occur, more than 100 years from now, every 210,000 blocks, you issue 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes divided by whatever number of halvings you are, 2 to the I. So using this equation, depending on where you are in the halving epoch, you can tell how much supply there should be or how much new issuance there should be. That's a very clear, simple representation of how the monetary policy works.
It's not like the days of the guy sitting in his own house, heating his house with computers everywhere is kind of gone now. Or going fast. It's too expensive for something like that to keep up.
It's very expensive, but if you're using the byproduct, which is the heat, then it could be useful to you. So I mean, mining is a really economically dense set of things that you have to evaluate. Like you were saying, it doesn't make sense in every case to mine at home in your garage off of your home heat. But if, say, you were going to create the heat anyway, it does make sense because then you're just getting an added benefit of, the hardest money in the world while you create some heat for yourself. Now, if you did not need the heat and you were just trying to mine in your garage, there's only some periods where it makes sense to do that.
It's not just the heat though, I have to, if my revenue halves, then I'm gonna have to bring in more computers. And the expenditure on that computing might not be worth the pickup.
It depends. Every time it depends. I mean, all things held equal, yes, you don't want your reward for the work that you're doing to get cut in half. But if you have a long-term view on the asset, if you think that Bitcoin is going to be more valuable in the future, even if your reward is cut in half, if you think it's going to 4x in the next few years, that's fine. That's a reasonable economic calculation. If you don't believe that's going to happen, then yeah, it's getting harder and harder, more expensive all the time to be a competitive miner. So you have to either have, some kind of competitive advantage, or be, highly committed to just in a self-sovereign way, getting your own coins, which is important because the balances on exchanges that people can just go buy and say, hey, Coinbase, I want some Bitcoin. That amount has been dwindling since 2020 and going down. It used to be well over 3 million coins on exchanges, and I think we're at like 1.8 now. But yeah, so if it does get harder and harder to mine further into the future. But miners have made either the economic call to just say this is going to be worthwhile, or they have optimized their operations to get their costs low enough that they're competitive. Because someone on the network is always profitable. Not everyone, and it changes how many people are, but somebody is always mining at a profit. And the ones who stick around the longest, who are the most entrenched and kind of embedded in that space, they get outsized rewards because they are resilient. They don't easily flake off of the network. So some illustrations of the math. The Bitcoin network is over 625 exahashes per second. That's what the miners are doing. An exahash is just a way of saying how many guesses per second it is. How many guesses per second it is creating in order to try to find this next block. And so just for perspective, that number 625 exahash, that is 70 times more hashes per second than there are grains of sand on the earth. It would take 2,000 years for the entire population of Earth, each performing 1 hash per second, to match the Bitcoin network hash rate. So to do what in 1 second the network does would take us thousands of years by hand. By number of raw operations per second, Bitcoin is 500 times more performant than today's most powerful supercomputer. So the security model of the Bitcoin network is, in my opinion, a really good one because there's just more energy being thrown at pure randomness and entropy to protect this thing than any other network in the world. There is no single supercomputer or supercomputing network that gets anywhere close to the raw amount of computing power that goes towards securing this network. So tying back to time, we had to create a system of digital money that doesn't rely on trust, that eliminates any kind of central authority controlling timestamps or time itself. So implementing this distributed timestamp server using a proof of work system is completely necessary in the digital realm in order to create something of value that can't be copied. So proof of work operates in a peer-to-peer environment because it is independent of external influences like clock readings, UTC, or any other third-party inputs. Proof of work relies solely on computational effort, which in our physical universe demands both energy and time. So wrapping up, in conclusion, we need to understand what money is in order to understand what actually makes good money. We've determined that a ledger is the best way to account for global currency, or the best solution that we had. Figured out that creating time is completely required in order to trust that your transactions and your ledger are accurate without depending on some outside source of information. We have to adjust the entire structure of time in order to assure that transactions are validated using the proof of work consensus. We had to define a hard-coded monetary policy that can't be changed, that is immutable and will last forever. We have to use energy to create costliness similar to gold and other commodities that take energy to produce, so that this monetary network can't be faked, can't be counterfeited. And we have to allow for that information to be transported through space and time and to become the world's main store of value. So in order for Bitcoin to work as a global form of money, it has to have all of the components that we talked about working in harmony, designed to perfection in order for it to be successful. We had to create a new sense of time, share, store, preserve, and verify information, have the qualities of money, and expend and reimagine energy. And with that, we'll take any questions.